pleased to see so many of you here. I'm sure Lord Owen really doesn't need any introduction. He's come to talk to us about Putin's Russia.
Well, thank you very much for asking me. Looking around, I see some familiar faces. Possibly it's meeting in Tesco's. I have a bit of affection for this town hall because I bought the old rectory Buckingham here in an open auction, and we decided as a family, once we were having children, Debbie and I, that we simply could not go on driving down to Plymouth every weekend, and we had to have a base. So we drew a circle just outside Newbury, just outside Marlborough. And one day a friend of ours wafted by and saw a Victorian rectory appearing out of the trees. And she remembered that Debbie said, "I like a house with trees all round." Well, the old rectory Buckingham certainly fulfills that. And I won the auction. I discovered against the farmer, old Mr. Waters, who'd been told that the Scientologists were about to buy them. Fortunately, he dropped out of the auction, but not without costing me a little bit more than I should have, but I never held it against him. Anyhow, it has been a wonderful place, and Hungerford is our market town, and so we have thoroughly enjoyed our time. So when the invitation came, there was really no question I had to come. And I have spoken before in this town hall on a number of occasions and in other meetings, and I do feel an obligation now as a citizen to talk when asked. Russia is in a frightful state at the moment, both in many, many senses of the word frightful. And it is hard to be sure what's going to happen, and people who tell you will not know. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, Riddle, Mystery and Enigma, 200 years of British-Russian relations. But the real reason some people say that I wrote this book was I wanted to write about the Battle of Navarino, which took place in 1820 in Greece, very close to a house which I built, and I still have a little nest in Greece. And I've loved the country ever since I was a young medical student. And that battle is an interesting battle because Canning, who was then the Foreign Secretary, decided that the Porte, the Muslims if you like, the Ottoman Empire, would never give up their thrust to take Greece unless they were beaten in battle. He's a very interesting Foreign Secretary, Canning, and he assembled a coalition very cleverly, taking a long time over it, so that by the time the battle came, Moscow was squared, Paris was squared. Sometimes he rather neglected his own base, and particularly the dire politician, though great general, Lord Wellington. Anyhow, we went into this battle. There were 17 ships, and we sunk the 60 vessels of the Ottoman Empire, from which they never recovered. And it was a masterly operation conducted by a British admiral. And so it is interesting to start with a battle which to Russia was an ally. And in the little village of Pylos, every year we mark the battle, and the Union Jack is run up the mast, and we sing God Save the Queen for a long time, and now the King. And then we have the French national anthem, and then we have the Russian national anthem. The Russians usually send ships, and the local girls love that, because they stay on, and they have a good time. And I've got used to, I must say, to be quite fond of Russia during this time, and was also making quite a reasonable amount of money in business in Russia. And it was easy easy to feel, well, the old Cold War was over. We've got a much different Russia to deal with. And in Moscow, instead of going to this city which never had a light on beyond 10 o'clock, it was rather a depressing place. It was alive, full of Russians making a lot of money, aided and abetted usually by American and some British businessmen. And Yeltsin seemed good cat, given up communism, decided to introduce a market economy, but as so often in recent years, our politicians, whether on this side of the Atlantic or on the other side, spent no money in the peaceful transition of Russia. They just let their market economy whip. There was no help to Yeltsin when he gave up the market. It meant huge financial burden, milk no longer subsidized, your rents no longer subsidized by market gains. No cushioning from the West, just going in, exploiting the money and walking out. And we have a very heavy responsibility, in my view, for the lack of support for President Yeltsin. He wasn't easy to help. Of course, he was, I very rarely use the rude word, but he was drunk most of the time. But he was brave, he was courageous, he knew the way for reform was through democracy, proper elections, and also a market economy. And on this particular aspect of the market economy, we sent our SPIVs and our financiers who were totally uninterested in Russia. And at the first sign of the ruble devaluation, they were off back to their places in Canary Wharf and Wall Street. I was modestly making money in a decent business called steel, and in a very modern plant which had been built by the Germans, and it became very successful. And everything seemed okay. But then this chap Putin arrived. Nobody's really noticing Putin. He was sort of number two at his highest point in St. Petersburg under a rather successful man. And then he came to Moscow and was taken on by Yeltsin's staff and treated rather as a sort of young KGB person who had reformed, and he started to build his way up. And when Yeltsin was getting older, remember that he shelled the Russian parliament, which wasn't exactly the best way of ensuring that you had a safe future ahead of you. And he got absolutely obsessed about the fact that he would be thrown out. So he looked around for a prime minister who would protect the family. He tried to, and he came to the conclusion that neither was really courageous enough to stand up to the undoubted forces that would emerge when he passed on. And suddenly he looked at this character who was within his own staff, and he promoted him twice, 3 times, 4 times. And suddenly he announced to the world that he was stepping down and that Putin would be acting president. And of course, by making him acting president, he more or less guaranteed that he won the presidential election. And the reason he did it was A, he underestimated the KGB links of Putin. I'm sure that he did that. But he did it to safeguard his own family. And there's a wonderful television set in which Putin is winning the election for president. And we're all watching on the open television coming in from Moscow. And he says, they say, come on, ring up the president, congratulate him. Oh no, he's busy either. Yeltsin by this time is a cardiac cripple generally, but he still has some sense of what might be the reception. Anyhow, eventually he rings up, and he's told that the president is busy, but he'll ring bring back later. So 2 hours later, when the television sets beginning to leave, everybody realized you see a forlorn unity. But next morning, the first thing Putin does is pass the laws to safeguard the family, to give them a house in a protected area near his own protected area outside Moscow, and he fulfills every single one of his commitments to the Putin family. And they would say that today, that he honored every obligation. But undoubtedly, we had underestimated this sense of loss, deep-seated loss, that many young and particularly KGB people had about the Russia that they had thought they were a member of. There have been too many humiliations in the passage towards democracy and towards the market economy. And deep in Putin's soul, undoubtedly, there was this deep sense of resentment. And the worst decision that had ever been taken was to give up the Russian Empire and acquire a resolution which was not apparent initially to put this to right. I remember he came over here to Moscow. I was involved in the oil company Yukos, a very big oil company, and I was the chairman of Yukos International. He stayed in Buckingham Palace, and there was Tony Blair at the reception, the dinner, and next day BP signed up with oil agreements. And it still looked as if we were going to have a reasonable transition, I must admit. I began to study Putin's personality, and I saw within it quite a lot of interesting aspects, which I was inclined to say was hubris, but I was not sure. But there was no doubt that there was elements in his character which were beginning to emerge that were causing concern. He'd already shown in the brutal repression of Chechnya. Mind you, you have to be honest. If you're going to get on top of the terrorist situation in Chechnya, you need to be pretty brutal. But it was done with speed, and you began to be sure that what you heard on the television was Putin's intentions. But it was probably very far removed from what they really were. And concern began to come into my calculations. And then he had the first of his invasions of Ukraine, 2014. For me, that was a warning sign. I immediately pulled my small British Ames company out of Russia and sold our assets as best we could, got a very good price from friendship. And I discovered that you can have good friendship with many of these people, though many of them, of course, in Russia are not really Russians. One of the main person I worked with in business was from Uzbekistan. And one of the biggest strengths of the Russian Empire under communism was they had no problems with accepting Muslims or any religion. That there was, in that strange sense, everybody was the same, except the few people who ruled. And they got used to, basically, dictatorship. And they found it quite easy to lapse back. It didn't happen immediately, but slowly, steadily, the signs of you were watching it. And I never regretted coming out of Russia, and I was shocked by the first sign I thought of appeasement to the West, that we let the first invasion of Ukraine go by, and all it was marked by was Minsk talking with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the French President Owen and Putin and his people. And they didn't move out of the territory they'd taken. And it was clear that something something was quite likely to occur again, but nobody quite knew when. So, what was the character of this man? At that time, he used to ride bareback on horseback, bareback on the horse and barely showing his pectoral muscles, with no shirt on. And it was pretty clear he was on not just testosterone, but he was on a more powerful steroids even, and he was beginning to change his character, I think, what he was saying. So I thought, well, he's got hubris, and he's just one of these many leaders who gets carried away with themselves. But I think I was wrong. I think he probably was hubristic under androgens for a period of time there. But beneath this exterior virility, symbolism, there was undoubtedly an abiding wish to get back to the big Russia of his time when he was a KGB spy of no great relevance or importance in East Germany. And it happened slowly, and then when things happen slowly, the Western democracies are pretty short in what they do. They tend to look for whether or not they get a good deal on a financial one. And when we put our sanctions on, we kidded ourselves this is going to affect Russia. It didn't, and they were not. Slowly, and more and more strength. Now I think we have to take a very, very big rethink of what's happened in Russia. At the end of in the summer in Washington, there will be a NATO summit. It will be the 75th anniversary of NATO. And before we get there, we in Europe will start taking some big decisions. And we're showing not the slightest signs any political party coming to grips with the realities of what we face. A lot of people think you can go to Washington in the summer and talk about how the Americans should be paying more for European defense. Forget it. The world has changed and America does understand it. They see China. You talk to the average European, they say, oh well, China's nothing to do with NATO. Hasn't it? Have we ever heard of what has been happening in the military alliance that has developed between Russia and China and that other very dangerous country, Iran, as well? We are facing 3 countries now locked in an alliance which extends to economic issues, to political issues, and to military issues. When Xi came to Moscow and the second invasion of Ukraine happened, he didn't criticize the invasion of Ukraine. How could he? He spent so time planning to take over Taiwan. Well, all he said, and it's important that he said it, we support you, but you must not use nuclear weapons. Putin has so far been constrained by that. But if you look at they're actually saying, particularly when they weren't doing very well in Ukraine, there's constant use. President Dmitry Medvedev, who Putin allowed to be president of Russia for 4 years, he took a break. And he never talks about the war in Ukraine without threatening nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons. I think these guys have got no idea of the dangers of nuclear weapons. They haven't had the education that we had in the long struggle to overcome the Soviet communism, when nuclear weapons was a very major issue. I wrote books about it, and I was worried about it. I come to this issue, I'm 85. I don't make a lot of set speeches publicly, but what I say today to you, in pretty well the exact form that I'm saying it, will appear, I hope, in the odd newspaper, perhaps a paragraph. It's extremely hard to get people in this country to understand that we need to spend more on defence and to face up to the challenge that it's not just Ukraine they're interested in. When I went to Moscow as Foreign Secretary, I negotiated with Brezhnev and Gromyko, the oldest living foreign minister that had ever been, and over 50 years, never been. And in those negotiations, they started off with one issue, and that was the 1975 Helsinki Agreement. And they challenged our interpretation of the Helsinki Final Act. And they said, we understood, and we know you understood as well, that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania would stay in the Soviet Union. And you rested on that thing. So upset was Gromyko, and I like Gromyko. He's a nice man, and in many respects, for just on purely personal terms. He never spoke down to me because I was so young. He educated me quietly about a few things in a very nice way. But there was no doubt about this. He asked me, do you want to go to the ballet, or would you like to have a music or more country music? I said, I've been to the ballet quite often, and I think you've been there probably 100 times. He smiled. So we settled for a private vacation. And of course, on the private vacation, I don't bring my interpreter, but I'm just relying on his interpreter. It's both big. And in the middle of this, he went back on this subject. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are ours, and you've stolen them. I believe he believed it. I believe he'd sold to the Politburo to sign the Helsinki Final Act because his interpretation had been accepted. And I don't believe for one moment people like Putin, who understand all these aspects of where they were giving up parts of their empire, didn't get them back, has Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in their eyes. And if you talk to the new democratic leaders of those three countries, they have no doubt whatever that's what they want. Now, there are some good signs. I mean, it's been very important that Finland has joined NATO. Finland is a very tough fighting force, and they know how to fight in really cold weather and snow. And now it's very important that Sweden has joined. They've given up 200 years of neutrality. And these are additions to NATO's strength and very much to be welcomed, and can probably do a lot to help any integration of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, three Baltic states. But when you look at the Baltic, I wonder how many of you realize that Russia sits on the Balkan. Kaliningrad, an isolated entity, stays and is now packed with nuclear weapons and other weapons as well. They haven't done this just for fun. They have aspirations on many of their borders, and there is no doubt in my mind that they could see themselves going through Belarus, Ukraine, in checking Poland, fighting Germany that doesn't spend anywhere near enough on defence and never has done since the end of the Second World War, and pushing through to Kaliningrad, and then Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Some of you sound exaggerating, maybe. But all I can tell you as a young man listening to Gromyko, and to Brezhnev, rather old, very old, making it quite clear he supported everything that Gromyko had said. They have, inside Russia, people who are not connected to Putin at all, but who still believe that Russia, big Russia, was stolen from them. And we better wake up. We've got to spend more on defense. Very hard to convince this country with its financial situation and its political leadership and parties that this is what we have to do. I'll do my best, but I don't claim that people listen very much to me these days. But I will try. And of course, I'm like everybody else. I want a new hospital in very many parts of the country. I was Minister of Health. I enjoyed that job at Denside more than being Foreign Secretary. And also, I have in my past as Minister of Navy. So I've been underwater in Florida on a Polaris submarine and watched the judder of the boat as the Polaris missile, in this case successfully, it was launched out in the open. Clearly we're not still doing it successfully. We've got quite a few problems with our military where we haven't spent enough. Anyhow, enough of that. What of the future now? What do we do now? Well, it certainly means, in my view, that before we go to Washington, there has to be increased spending, and clearly seen increased spending, and particularly so if Trump were to be re-elected. One of the things that we have got to be able to say if we are faced by a Trump presidency is, Mr. President, you were correct. You told NATO European members you had to pay away. You had to, couldn't rely on America to go on paying their defense bills. You were affluent enough to pay for this yourself. And this has happened. And we are now spending the very minimum, I think. They say now 2.5%, but don't give it time. We've got to start being 2.5% before we turn up in Washington. And then we've got to understand that we have to parcel out some of the world's problems. It is inevitable that the United States are going to have to spend more on defense in order to contain China. Absolutely inevitable. And look what's happening already. Some of you remember Burma, now called a rather different Myanmar. But that's basically, without anybody really noticing in this country, being taken over by communist or military-orientated, China-supported country. Huge refugee problem for Bangladesh. Huge problems for India. They don't say very much about it. But just remember, China's on India's borders. There's fighting which we don't hear very much about, going on all the time. They are very concerned about China in India and in Bangladesh. We have got friends, but they'll always look, are you just a voice friend, or are you an arm friend? Have you got the capacity and the will and the energy to support us? Remember, Pakistan has already made its choice. It did that under Bhutto when he got nuclear technology. And it was because Pakistan got nuclear technology that India has also developed nuclear weapons. So the world is an unstable place at the moment, and likely to get more unstable. And we must stop being listening to these people that economic sanctions will be the answer to it. The Treasury Minister under Biden is a very able woman called Owen. She used to be the head of the Federal Reserve. And she told us when the second invasion took place that we could have economic sanctions against Russia. It would deal with it in this way. must admit, I thought that she's a sensible person. I don't know about it all now, I have my doubts, but I thought it would work. But it's not only not worked, it has actually strengthened the Russian, Chinese, and it's hard to strengthen the Iranian economy, but it's not a normal economy and not a normal country. Don't underestimate this military alliance. And when Russia started running out of weapons in Ukraine, who did they go to? North Korea. They were shipping, mainly by train, filling the munitions gap, just like that. No questions asked, immediately questioned, supply. We are not just facing Russia. We're facing Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Iran didn't just send drones with cannons on them, they sent drones capable of carrying weapons. Fortunately, the Ukrainians are ingenious people, and they have held this battle of the drones. This quite extraordinary new battle, new weapon systems that are going on. And they've been pretty successful. But if Europe allows Ukraine to be defeated, then they deserve everything that they'll get. And I talk almost in the abstract. They. I won't be there. But not a lot of you will be here. But those you love, your children, things will be here. I don't say there'll be a straight-out war. It'll be cleverly and cleansely done. They'll be inching their way through and waiting and things. And if we just ignore it, and then we have the problem here of President Trump, Donald Trump. Well, my wife is American, and I've grown used to judging. She's called all my elections in Hungerford correctly, and from the doorstep, and is one of the best canvassers I've ever had. And arguably my sister is the only one who's been able to keep up the same rate in a very marginal seat. But I'm a Bloomer, been born and bred, so they stayed with me throughout my political career, very marginal seat. But what I'm saying is who knows what will happen with Trump. I wrote this book called Hubris, The Road to Donald Trump. I'm not sure how many of you can see it, but look at the quizzical face of Trump as he looks at Boris. He doesn't quite know what this chap's up to. I don't think many of us are quite sure what he's up to. But thereby hangs the story too, of how difficult it might be if we were to face a Trump government. There's no doubt we might persuade him to still stay with some troops and some nuclear weapons in Iraq. America increased their nuclear deterrence by having more nuclear planes in airfields in this country only a few months ago, which is a very welcome sign. But there would be a change if Trump was there. And we would be much more on our own and not so sure of what's coming. So a degree of independence, a degree of cleverness is absolutely imperative. What would I do? Find my way. Well, Germany tries, but they're in a mess. In many ways, none of us want a militant Germany. We've twice had that, thank you very much. And their own reluctance to become a military power is something which in many ways quite all of us both understand and like. They're starting to spend more. We're very sceptical about how much it is. And there's even talk of them getting nuclear weapons. I personally didn't try to prevent that, but I see great problems, and I don't think it's going to happen anyhow. Germany will spend more on defense. defence, but they're not going to be the really important thing if we have a weakness in America. The only country that you can fight with, and we've known it over a long period of time, is France. I know you're linked to a French town, and we are linked to French. We're all furious with French on frequent occasions, and they with us. But they're still a great country. They still have serious defence forces. They are the only country in Europe, like us, permanent members of the Security Council, and with the veto. They are the only European power, like us, to have a nuclear deterrent, both strategic and tactical. President Macron, sometimes the best thing is to say not very more than that. But there is pretty clear evidence that he has learned his lesson. Do you remember those long tables that Putin would need? And Macron would be summoned in to sit at the end of this table. I never could understand, why would he lift up a chair, just move it into the middle of the table and sit down, instead of being pushed out right at the end of it. However, he's refreshingly and very importantly changed his mind about Putin, and he clearly sees that this is no longer somebody who can be wooed around a negotiating table. And he's starting to say some sensible things about that. There is no question Britain should now start a new entente out and use the two countries that have really got power in Europe and harness that power and be able to speak with one voice. And whether we're in NATO or whether France is in the EU or Britain outside the EU in dealing with Australia and other areas, harmonise power and start to think and act together. It's the only thing we can do. And if we seem to do it, it would be liked in Washington. It would seem to be taken seriously. And funnily enough, if they see you taking the defence seriously, they'll be more inclined to stay with a smaller force, but to stay in NATO. You could hold NATO together. I know it sounds ridiculous when you think about France's attitude to NATO, de Gaulle wanting to leave most of the time. Now, people say to me, well, Le Pen may come. Well, I think Le Pen should have more sense about most of the world problems that are being thrust at her. She's been in transition. A lot of people on the far left coming to be sensible. And I think France would stay united on defence. So do it now. And we should see Sunak and Macron coming together. We should look at the two nuclear deterrents. There's no need to merge them or anything like that. They should stay independent. But we should know where their targets are, and they should know where our targets are. There's some pretty strong evidence that we have never actually talked together to stop overlapping our targets. And if we are weak, which we certainly are, then we should use that appreciation and have some understanding amongst ourselves of a kind of waste time firing at the same targets. Sometimes, yes, of course, big ones, but small ones we will allocate between ourselves. And start showing a determination and a strength that we're perfectly capable of doing, and if we have the people of this country and France realistic, and if they know that we have to spend more on defence, with reluctance they'll do it, and we have to do it. That's my message to you today. We have to do it. I put out a speech. I don't normally do these things, but maybe it will be read by a few defence correspondents, but I don't have any influence with the present Prime Minister. It would have to be an issue at the election, and you, in your ways, will choose to vote the way they want you to, but hold them to account in this election. Tell them that they have got to take their courage in both hands and spend more on defence, even in our straitened circumstances and in financial difficulty. And we, and I include myself in your generation, know how much easier life would have been if we'd been better prepared for the war, the Second World War, and the First World War. And remember, we needed American help in the First World War and in the Second World War, and we'll need it in the Third World War if there ever is one. And there won't be one if America is firmly on this side of the Atlantic as well as the other. So there are big issues ahead. If America sees us being serious in defense, then they'll probably do it, even maybe Trump. And I didn't finish the story about my wife. She has not shifted her position 1 inch. She believes Trump will win this election. I keep saying, well, Biden is doing this, Biden is doing that. Makes no difference. There are a hell of a lot of Americans who believe that. Well, we'll have to see. But America is a great country, and it will, remember, it's got to look after all those different parts of the Pacific countries which supports. We're building an aircraft, a military aircraft with Japan and Italy. Very interesting combination. Some people are saying that should be scrapped. It needs to go ahead. But who knows? I'm not going to get into all these complicated procurement issues or try to fight all the Whitehall problems. If we respond soundly, if France and Britain seem putting their act together, if Germany is starting to spend more on defence, by the time we come to the summer conference in Washington, President Biden will still be there, then I think there is a chance. But if we go to Washington, seeming to think that America will go and bail us out, and having taken no proper serious decisions about defence, it won't be long before Americans won't put their troops at risk on the shores of Europe. And that would be a very, very, very serious and dangerous situation. As long as they're here, there's never going to be the sort of war that we saw in the Second World War. But if they disappear, then we can have a very nasty war. And Russia has enough pretensions and wishes and enough capacity to mobilize other forces. Germany is working with Poland. Very good, we should encourage them. And they would, I think, understand perfectly the rationality of Britain working closer with France. So there we are. I hope some of my pessimism is not ever reached, and that we will realize what we need to do and do so fast. And if we do, and we harness American power if we can, even if it so passes that we have Trump, we can only hope. But there is a first step. Britain has to increase its defence spending, and it must be an issue in the next election. If the country wants to have a serious debate, the Labour Party, which in the past has shown itself fully capable of spending on defence, prime ministers and foreign secretaries, the calibre of Attlee and Bevin, but also Wilson, Callahan. There's never any doubt where Dennis Healey stood on many of these issues. There is the people in all the political parties of this country who have shown this capacity to stand for them. And so I'm confident that given the right leadership, given some strength, that Britain can play an influential role, as it has done always in Europe. And if it is to do so with France, no problem. More chance.
does bother about elections. I think my question possibly would be, and it was sort of brought up by somebody else, is how we engage younger people in these. I'm always very disappointed when I see election results about the low level of the population who actually vote. And I know we can't go down the path of compulsory voting, but how do we encourage young people to actually use their vote? I mean, yes, agree on spending, and we would probably agree, but how do we encourage? One of the questions that we received from here was perhaps bringing back national service.
Well, I have mulled that over many, many times. Not the old form of national service where everybody did it, but where you could choose. You could go into the armed services, or you could do social work, or you could do other different forms. And I'll tell you a joke about our President King. I made a speech at the university about this, and got a lot of publicity about exactly what I shaped out. And I had a letter come through with a draft speech from the Prince of Wales. Unfortunately, Margaret Thatcher had already announced that the reader of the SDP's speech was a load of nonsense, and she wouldn't have anything to do with it at all. No doubt encouraged by the generals, who don't like national service in any form or shape. And so I had to write back to the President King and say, "Sir, I agree with everything you said, but you can't make that speech." Well, he wrote back and said, "Why ever not?" So I wrote him a tougher speech back, saying, "You can't." The Prime Minister has made it clear that this is not the policy of the country, and you can't say it. But I think there is a mood. There is a slight increase in the number of schools and state schools that have military units in them. I don't know what there's around here, but that's on the increase. So I think that that's one way to encourage it. But the other thing is to treat the young as adults, and even if they've just come on the voting register, speak to them straight about some of these issues. They're not fools. And I think we do sometimes take these subjects like defence or the economy more to them and trust them and chat to them and deal with it. Of course, in my constituency, I would go around speaking to them at all schools. And it paid off after all. They became voters. But we haven't got that much time. I think that we've got, even in the present and the next future Parliament, we don't need to decide about the election and who wins or anything like that, but they've had a rough ride, some of these. It's not been a pleasant scheme to watch the House of Commons deteriorate. But there is an inner strength there. Substantially, I may say, for having a very much higher percentage of women than when I was there. And I think that women on many issues have got more steel than men. So I think that it's not on their agenda. They've got to put it on their agenda. And I mean, the politicians don't want it because they don't want to commit spending, so they will encourage it. So how it goes on the agenda, even public meetings are much less than they used to be. And I think we should, but when they come wanting votes, you call a meeting, they'll be there in an election period and give them a rough ride. I can tell you it matters, particularly in elections. They focus on these things. Take it to them. Demand they come, they'll come. All parties. And then one speaks and then the other speaks. And nobody will want to be shown isolated. You have power. This organisation has considerable power. You come together on many different things. You're an active force. just have their agenda, but you have an agenda which they must address.
Has anybody got any other questions? There's a microphone.
Lord Owen, when Putin invaded the eastern Ukraine and took over Crimea, had you been Prime Minister, what would you advise their government to do and what would you advise the Americans?
Well, when that happened, Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, and I really poked a little fun at him, but he was absolutely solid. And he's been of all the European political leaders, and we've done a hell of a lot of Prime Ministers and Presidents in that short space of time, because there's been a lot of movement. He is the best. And there's no doubt that we have managed to maintain that. And I think that support for Ukraine has become a pretty strong British commitment and is seen by the response of people in this part of Wiltshire, actually, giving up their homes and having Ukrainians staying in their families and that sort of thing. We've taken our share, and a lot of people have been around here in Wiltshire. And I think that there is a readiness to stand by Ukraine in Britain. But I think that has got to become in Europe. And I will say this, I'm a Brexiteer, but I think that van der Leyen has been excellent as President of the Commission, which is not involved in defence, and in my view never should be. That's NATO. But she has drawn the bell for support for Ukraine and come up with a big issue, which is we don't have armament factories any longer in many countries. We don't have the capacity. And she's starting to organise an industrial response to manufacture munitions, which is in her responsibility, and to do so in a rational way. So I think she's been excellent. As I say, I don't want to use the European defence of the EU. I think we need military organisation, and I think NATO is very good. And after all, it's an ingenious idea that when Ukraine is attacked, that we would not be parties to the war. We are, after all, a defensive organisation, but we would supply them with weapons. But we lost the spirit. And that's the real trouble. We have lost the capacity to stick it out. The whole idea of, Ukraine has beaten Russia, and is still beating it in terms of having the massive land that they've recovered. And we have got to go on helping Ukraine. If Russia is held just on some of the fringe areas, now, the question of Crimea itself, this doesn't trouble me terribly. I mean, there was always something rather odd when Russia was, beginning to pull back, and communism had gone, and Putin was in the palace day and night. Why didn't they have a port that they owned? They hired from the Ukrainians, Sebastopol. So if we end up with a negotiated settlement, and that's how wars end, I don't think there's anything wrong with Russia having a port, proper port, in the Black Sea, as long as they are not anywhere near Odessa to threaten Ukraine having its port. And as we've shown, grain is still going out through Odessa, along the coast, and in fact, the President of Turkey, who has a different policy most weeks, but it's quite a clever policy, he managed to serve his interests as well, but he was behind a lot of the movement of Russian aid to get, and Africa, and third world countries, to get grain out. So I could see a line drawn in there, which would be can do say to everybody, wars end in negotiations, not an outright victory. Outright victories are very rare. And the wise people avoid it. The Second World War was unusual in that we were absolutely determined this time to have no peace settlement. This time there had to be. But even so, Eisenhower was clever enough to write to Marshal Stalin from General Eisenhower to say, you can take Berlin. Then, of course, they had Berlin, Russians cut the railway, cut the road, and everything like that. But they forgot that we could fly in, and we flew things into Berlin. Most young people have forgotten all about that. Cold War is long since out of people's memories. But we can be ingenious, and we can be tough, and we can fight well. And I mean Europe, democratic Europe, can do that. And we're strengthening greatly, as I said, by having Finland and Sweden in NATO alliance. Stick to NATO alliance. Don't muck about. You need a general to take positions. There's a wonderful story about Ernest Benny. The Foreign Office, somebody may know my view of diplomats, is they needed a little stiffening of the spine. And they were coming into, when the NATO treaty was being designed, they're coming in with words. Anyway, they said, well, your wartime snatchers soften the way. I want it clear as daylight that the people who are controlling NATO is the President of the United States and the General who's the Supreme Allied Commander. Sent them off the fleet in the air, they came back with a bit of tougher language. Now, of course, we don't want it spelled out completely and absolutely, but for all through the Cold War, the person who would decide if there was a war, if Russia upped the ante on us, would be the President of the United States. That was the nature of the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, was always held by the Americans. The French were very bad about this and mucked around and tried to base unreality. But that was the reality. You don't think about EU defence, that's not serious. NATO is still a serious military organisation. It knows how to make decisions, it knows when you have to start fighting. And if you know that, your opponent knows it. With that, there is no fighting.
Going back to Putin, what sort of setup did he come from? I mean, what sort of family did he come from?
He came from St. Petersburg, from a poor family, and sometimes exaggerates perhaps a little the extent of the poverty that he lived in. But he was obviously singled out and was able to go where he wanted to be, which was on a spy. But he got into a group of illicit traders, particularly oil, in St. Petersburg. When he came out of the KGB, when Russia collapsed, he became the deputy to the democratic and rather good mayor, who was eventually ousted. And during that time, he formed a friendship with a person who now nominally runs the whole of Russia's oil exporting industry, and it's widely believed that Putin has a very substantial shareholding here. And some people say he is the richest man in the world.
He's not even in the right group.
Mock him, you see, that's the thing to do. Navalny, why he's being killed, is, you may remember that watching that on television, and they discovered this massive, great Putin house, mansion, underground hockey rink, and all these different things. And Navalny went on television with this and mocked him. Don't mock a dictator, it's a dangerous sport.
Do you ever see a day when the opposition will rise up completely in Russia and make sure that they respect war and the value? And do you ever see that day?
I do, because I did spend, trying to work out, nearly 20 years doing business in Russia. And I saw how effective they could be and how remarkable they could be. And this big steel mill, very close to the Sea of Azov, it's right down 600 kilometers south of Moscow. And it had a iron ore mine close by, which took its iron ore in a surrey of water down a pipe, so there were no lorry costs. And it produced a very, very high quality steel before any of this happened, one under real Russian communism. And Harley Davidson was using their steel even in those days. And the type of people that I really respect them. Of course, the whole thing was ridiculous. The city, the steel mill ran the hospital, they ran the salami factory, they ran all these things. And we gave it all back. And so the town, the city, a lot of good things were done during those years. Gorbachev, and Yeltsin, and Russia was starting to purr and become a competitor around the world, doing very well indeed. It's such a tragedy that was lost, that opportunity was lost. I don't know whether we could have learned those lessons. I hope we have. So to answer your question, I think that there is still now an active generation of Russians who do remember that there are different ways of living other than under Putin dictatorship. And I still think that they will not be completely knocked out. But this is the hard thing. This is a hardcore alliance. Putin talks about it. Relationship with China is without limits. Well, we've seen one of its limits when she said you don't use nuclear weapons. And there's a lot of wisdom in China. There's still the threat to Taiwan and all of that. We have to be careful here. I don't say Taiwan has to stay in the present position. I say Taiwan is a negotiable issue. A British position. We recognise China long before Nixon, British government, because we've been much more sensible about China policy. We've never committed ourselves to saying, but if you had to guess, you'd say there'd be a military takeover of Taiwan.
Do you think Russia has agents within the Republican Party in the States?
Has Russia got agents in the Republican Party? Absolutely yes. And in the book, I give evidence, which is solid evidence. There was an inquiry about how much Russian influence there was in the previous election, and very considerable. One that Trump won.
Do you think Trump could be one of those agents?
I think Trump is one of. And I think it's very difficult to know how to deal with it. But I think actually, funnily enough, the combination of Theresa May and Boris Johnson worked quite well with Trump for a while. Of course, he's dangerous because there are a lot of things that are undesirable. understand the Democratic Party. I can't understand the Democratic Party. I can't understand why anybody over the age of 75 puts them before the electorate, themselves before the electorate. I mean, you know, you saw a moment where I was stretching for the name of the Biden. Of course you see him do this. It's ridiculous. You're making the leader of the free world, electing him at his age when it's perfectly apparent that he's got what most of us have got. And I think it's ridiculous. How do you stop it? I write about it. I've been writing about mental decrepitude for a very long time. I keep telling you, step down. Let other people have a chance. It's amazing that we don't have more understanding of this issue. And Putin is still, he's of course getting older. He made some big mistakes. He's not by any means invulnerable. Look what happened when the Wagner group split off. Look at that convoy going up through. And the Wagner convoy shot down Russian planes sent by Putin and tanks and still processed to Moscow. Then they stopped. And for a few days you didn't hear from Putin. It was extraordinary. And then those same Wagner people were told, oh, you can go on going to Africa, and got some compromise. Then they made the mistake of the three leaders from the St. Petersburg travelling in the same plane. No plane, no Wagner group. Putin was behind the whole bloody thing. So, but he didn't. He doesn't need to show aggression, funnily enough. I mean, that was watched very carefully, descale. I do it a bit in this book, not enough probably, because it happened afterwards. The book was published, that's why it wasn't there. I think this indicates that Putin is well equipped mentally and intelligent. He has made mistakes, but he seems to recover. And he hasn't got this sort of false vanity that he, having made a mistake, he has to sort of pretend he hasn't made a change. He makes changes. So that makes him a tougher opponent than we might deal with. But he'll start deteriorating. And he hasn't been very wise over the whole handling of Ukraine. And this sort of extraordinary business of rewriting Russian history and trying to pretend Ukraine never existed. All this stuff. Nonsense. So I'm not, but he's not, he's no fool, Putin. And he doesn't find it necessary to demonstrate power. When he's in a weak position, he shuts up. But he's readjusting the players in the game. So we must take him pretty seriously. In fact, very seriously, not pretty seriously, very seriously.
Lord Owen, you say all wars come to a negotiated settlement. In your opinion, do you think we should have a negotiated settlement now with the Donbass and Crimea and give that to Putin and advise Kaczynski to settle, which he doesn't want to, does he?
I think because we have mucked around and not provided sufficient weaponry and had too much of a discussion about what's happening, I think we now have to see military victories, and then there'll be a moment. I think it's not a good time to open negotiations. I think that, I mean, we promised that one open aircraft, old American aircraft. Why have they not come? Is it Germany who's blocked it? Germany's blocked a lot of sophisticated weaponry. It's been a very good thing. We've all seen what Germany is doing. And again, Britain has been quietly going on with supplying French, British missile, which has been shooting down all their battleships and a few other prime targets. And it's now been discovered that we have a few people there. Well, Britain doesn't find anywhere where there's no SAS. The government never says anything about it, but we understood that normal conventional forces just need to have the underpinning of a different type of force, and that goes for some of these weapon systems. But people are afraid, and particularly the German Chancellor is afraid of crossing the Rubicon and ending up with a fight on their hands. War involves risks, the calculated risks. By and large, there is no way that we could say we are combatants in Ukraine. Ukraine is doing the fighting, and that's how it should stay. But we should have more sophisticated weapons. We've got to be careful there. If you consistently knock out key bits of Russian transmission, roads or bridges, you could find them winding all. These are calculated decisions which we pay our generals and admirals to make. And so far, they've done very well. And Britain has done very well. There's no doubt about that. But that isn't enough. Germany has spent more money on Ukraine than Britain has.
It does seem to be a bit of a stalemate at the moment, doesn't it? You know, Donbass and Crimea and Russians, if anything, are starting to advance again. So
Yes.
we've got to put more in if we're going to get Donbass back and get Crimea back.
Well, this is one of the troubles that we do face, and the American generals have been telling them, for God's sake, get out. Well, who thinks that this is not a vital asset? And as a result of fighting in some places which are not vital, they've lost some areas which are vital. So now you can go from Crimea right down to the Donbass, around the Sea of Azov, with Russian forces all the way there. And at one time it looked as if the Ukrainians had permanently divided that line on the sea, and that they would not be a continuous line. I think that was a serious loss to deal with that. But this is not our way. We chose not to fight it as combatants. We chose to back them as a defense relationship. So we must be careful not to spend too much time telling them what to do. On the other hand, it's a bad sign that the President of Ukraine has changed the military leadership. It's a bad sign that the speculation that that's because he would be a very big competitor at the next election. I think that at this juncture, fairly soon, the existing president should say, I'm not going to fight the next election. I've asked you to postpone elections, and I'm not going to be a candidate. I'm going to be, go back to my old joke of my old rule of making you laugh. But I'm not going to fight to be permanently president. That's the sort of detachment that is now needed. There's some not very good features about what's happening in Ukraine. We've got to be careful. I hope that has been said to him by wise people. I mean, he's been amazingly successful president and done a wonderful job. And I'm very, very against criticising him in public and trying to tell him what to do. But, there were openings. Henry Kissinger was on the spot when he said, you return to the status quo ante. Since most people don't know what the status quo is or the language, let alone ante, practically nobody knew what he said. But what he said is go back to the situation after the first invasion, and then don't go back, of course, to what was before the first invasion. He was a wise man, Henry Kissinger. Very wise man.
Putin, something happens to him. There are lots of people around, lots of people follow on.
Who would follow
Oh, there are some pretty nasty people.
up? Yeah, so the question is, if Putin was something happened to him, who would follow on, and would they be equally nasty? Well, Dmitry Medvedev, who was actually rather helpful to us when he was president, has certainly become a very he was president and all this situation was getting very bad in Libya, we went to the Security Council and asked for a resolution to intervene with Gaddafi to allow this military intervention. The French and British, David Cameron was prime minister. And Medvedev abstained. So it went through the UN. After having abstained, we dropped all knowledge. There was a Russian NATO committee. We never went, they having allowed us to go in through the UN force. We never went to discuss with their journalists the difficulties we were having on the ground, how difficult it was to deal with Gaddafi, and how difficult it was to fulfill our commitment, which we had said openly that we're not involved in changing the head of government. We were lying. It was not David Cameron, nor Britain, nor France. Sarkozy was the French Prime finest art. And of course, Medvedev was then criticized by Putin, even though he was president. And I think the sort of anger went into his soul, and now I think he's very strongly anti-West. You've got to pay back. If you persuade them to do things, you've got to show that you acknowledge it. You've got to, I mean, we've had some lousy strategic thinking during that, how to handle that transition. It was a very important change. So he was Putin get back. But I don't know whether Medvedev, I don't think, probably he's just trying to ensure his position by being the tough man who's saying the powerful things, and it doesn't mean anything more than that. But it's certainly relevant. I mean, he seems to think there's no problem with the tactical nuclear weapons exchange. Believe me, it's a hell of a problem. If you start engaging in tactical nuclear warfare, containing it is going to be almost impossible. And that was one good thing to come out of all this, that China does seem to understand. So come back to one of the things that we should be doing is finding a modus vivendi with China in the Pacific. And that's why I'm very glad we are involved with Australia in building their nuclear submarines. Submarines, oil-fired submarines, they're no bloody good from Australia up to Taiwan. You need to have nuclear submarines, and they will get them. So I don't want Britain to give up a sort of purely European role, nor France. The aircraft carriers, nobody would put an aircraft carrier unless they're quite mad into the Baltics, so it would be taken out immediately. If it has a role, which is questionable, it's in where it's stationed actually off Oman, the two aircraft carriers, that's where they've got it, and in the Indian Ocean and occasionally in the Pacific. And it's a great help to the US Navy. They'll always want to work with the British, and they'll go out of their way to have a British destroyer with them, and they love having a British aircraft carrier, and they'll let us fly their planes off it and pretend that they're ours. You know, the admiral-to-admiral relationship is extremely good between the US Navy and the British Navy. I bless the day that I was made Minister for the Navy by Harold Wilson. I'll tell you one last story. I was spending the whole of dinner on how to topple Harold Wilson with Labour MP and I did, Robert McLaren. And the men with medallions go around with notes, and they suddenly discovered that I was in the dining room. And they said, "Oh, number 10 wants to see you." I looked out to see whether there were any microphones who'd got a conversation, but there weren't any, so I go off down. I'd never been to number 10. I was 2 years an MP. I'd never been in place. And I go through, walked in, there's no arms, the door opened by a policeman, seeing somebody come, very dark, walked down. He says, "Well, do you know where the cabinet room is? I said, straight down, go straight down. There's Harold Wilson, alone in the room, nobody else there, working on the desk in the cabinet room. And he said, hello David, sit down. Well, he said, I'm going to be about Bush, he said. I want you to be the Secretary of the Royal Navy. I was so naive that I blurted out, but Harold, I'm one of your biggest critics. It can't be now, he said.
Well, at least we ended on a cheerful. Can I just on behalf of everybody say thank you very much. I was told by your PA